Brago, will you now please convene the Committee on Governmental Relations?
Thank you, Chair Day. Will the Committee on Governmental Relations please come to order? I note that no speakers have requested to address the committee during today's public comment period. It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Is there any objections to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. On today's discussion agenda, we have two information items. The first information item is a state legislative update. Vice Chancellor Garrett Ashley, please introduce the report.
Thank you, Trustee Abrego. Today we present our first advocacy and legislative report for 2020. With a full agenda for the year ahead, our Sacramento team has been actively engaged throughout the interim recess. We use the recess to continue to work on legislation that remains active, lay the groundwork for budget advocacy this year, develop educational materials for the upcoming bond, and prepare for the busy legislative year ahead. Assistant Vice Chancellor Nicole Munoz Murillo is here to share recent advocacy activities, provide an update on legislation affecting the CSU, and preview our budget advocacy plans for this spring. Nicole?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. I'd like to begin with an overview of our recent advocacy activities. Interim recess is a time when legislators and staff have a break to explore policy matters in depth and develop legislative bill proposals. Last fall, we were able to create many opportunities for engagement with members and staff on a variety of topics, such as the graduation initiative, K-12 and community college partnerships, and campus infrastructure needs. In cooperation with our team, 7 campuses hosted delegations of legislators and our key staff on policy and fiscal committees, the Department of Finance, and the Legislative Analyst Office. These opportunities allow us to be responsive to their information requests, showcase our system priorities, and lay the groundwork for issue areas that will be of interest to the legislature in the coming year. One example of this legislative engagement that we had over the recess is depicted in the photo currently on the screen. The Senate Select Committee on Student Success, chaired by Senator Steve Glazer, held 2 committee hearings on CSU campuses, one at Cal Poly Pomona, where this photo was taken, and the other at Dominguez Hills. These hearings focused on the graduation initiative and student basic needs. Members interacted with campus representatives to learn firsthand about programs in place for meeting students' food, housing, and mental health needs. The senators felt that these discussions were valuable to their work, and the committee has expressed a desire to have more of these hearings on our campuses this year. Our team is currently working with staff to determine future locations and hearing dates. This is just one example of the interactions that we had with the legislature over the interim recess. Thank you to all of the campuses that worked with our team to turn these events into opportunities to highlight successes and our resource needs. After a recess full of activity, January has brought the return of the legislative session, and I will now turn to my legislative update. The legislature returned to the second year of the 2019-20 session on January 6th. January is a critical month for 2-year bills, those that were introduced in 2019 but did not advance from the House that they were introduced in. These bills have until the end of this week to pass off the floor of their House of origin. If a bill does not meet this deadline, it will be considered dead for the session and it can no longer advance in the legislative process. Given the tight time frame, we only expect a handful of these bills to advance to the second House. Consequently, many of the bills that you see in your report today will no longer be active by the next board meeting. At the same time, there are numerous bills that were introduced last year that have already advanced to the second House. For example, on page 6 of your agenda, you will see AB 1314 by Assemblymember Jose Medina. This bill was introduced last year as a vehicle for implementing financial aid reform. For several months, the California Student Aid Commission has led a working group of stakeholders aimed at informing changes to the Cal Grant program, and both the Chancellor's Office and CSSA have a representative on the working group. The working group will have their final meeting next week, and CSAC has scheduled a special meeting to share their recommendations on February 20th. At this point, the details and exact direction are still being refined, but we are working closely with Academic and Student Affairs and CSSA to ensure that the financial perspectives of our students are well represented. We will update the board as the financial aid reform discussion progresses. Moving to newly introduced legislation, on page 7 of your agenda, you will see several bills that were introduced in the first 2 weeks of this year that are relevant to the CSU. While the list will grow significantly as the legislature has until February 21st to propose new legislation, I do want to highlight AB 1862 by Assemblymember Miguel Santiago. This bill prohibits the CSU from charging mandatory system-wide tuition or fees for up to 2 years to any California Community College transfer student who earned an associate degree for transfer or received a fee waiver under the Community College California College Promise Program, also sometimes referred to as free community college. At this early phase of the legislative process, we are still analyzing it to fully understand its policy and fiscal implications and its potential budget impact, which will likely be significant. I will keep you apprised as the bill's impacts become clear. I also want to make the board aware of one bill of note that was introduced after your agenda was finalized. AB 1930 by Assemblymember Jose Medina requires the CSU and requests the UC to engage in a multi-step process when considering and or changing the university's admission requirements. In consultation with academic and student affairs and discussion with the author staff, we believe that the process of the bill is consistent with the quantitative reasoning proposal that will be presented to you tomorrow. Between now and your March meeting, our team will closely monitor all bills that are introduced and work with our Chancellor's Office colleagues to understand the potential impacts of proposed legislation. During my March presentation to you, I will provide a comprehensive report on newly introduced bills. With that said, we have a full year ahead of us, with budget advocacy being our top priority. I'd now like to provide you an overview of the advocacy strategy and activities we have planned for the coming year. There are 3 fundamentals to our budget advocacy strategy. 1, we have a great story to tell. As campuses continue to achieve historic gains in realizing the goals of Graduation Initiative 2025, we have a compelling case to make for the state's return on investment in the CSU. 2, we have the proven success of our collective advocacy efforts. To that end, we have asked CSSA, the Academic Senate, CFA, CSUEU, and the Teamsters to join in a collective advocacy effort over the next 5 months. Our hope is that we can work in a collaborative manner to elevate the CSU budget request and ensure that the CSU budget is augmented. 3, relationships. Our system and campus leaders have strong relationships with key decision makers. We will ensure that we engage our leaders as appropriate over the next few months. I'd now like to move to how we implement these strategies in the coming months. On this slide, you can see the timeline of our key budget advocacy activities. In January and February, we have asked our campuses to meet with their local assembly and Senate members in their districts to educate their delegation on our budget request and the need to augment our budget. In March and April, our focus will shift to Sacramento. Our annual CSU Advocacy Day is scheduled for March 11th. As in past years, we will work to make this a unified CSU Advocacy Day by joining with students, faculty, staff, and alumni to collectively make the case for additional investment in the CSU. This partnership allows for a unified front to show the value of the CSU system to the state. During these months, our team will also be working inside of the building, as March and April are 2 of the busiest months of the year for budget, policy, and fiscal hearings. Finally, once the May revision is released and prior to the budget being passed in June, we will again launch a targeted social media campaign to raise awareness and support for your budget request. We are also working to create additional visibility and advocacy opportunities. As details of those occasions become available, I will share them with you. In sum, we have a lot of important work ahead, from engaging on continuing a newly introduced legislation to advocating for your budget request. I look forward to keeping you apprised of the work we are doing in Sacramento. Trustee Abrego, that concludes my report. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nicole, for your presentation. Do we have any questions? Romy?
Thank you for your report. I have a question regarding several bills. SB3, Allen Bill, which calls for the institution of an Office of Higher Education Coordination, Accountability, and Performance. It is an active Senate bill. I guess it's from last year. Isn't it obsolete since the governor instituted his Council for Higher Education? This is my first question. I have 4
Okay.
on 4 bills, so you can answer them in succession. AB 1154, the Early Care and Education Major Pilot Program. Now, this description reads that the bill establishes a pilot program for us, the CSU, to provide BA degrees. I wonder why legislation is necessary. I mean, we need legislation if we want to offer independent PhDs because that they are the territory of the UCs. But if the legislators order us to or compel us to offer BA degrees, isn't that an interference in our determination of academic programs? And there are two bills whose purpose I cannot fathom. Maybe they're in response to recent events. AB 1155, Campus Affiliated Sorority and Fraternity Transparency Act. We are supposed to collect information from each sorority and fraternity. What information and for what purpose? And the other purpose that I don't understand or I can guess is AB 1836, the public post-secondary education CSU reporting. And they want us to report on specified parking and transportation related information and discretionary account information. That sounds to me like a bill that was written in response to the state audit that we had last year. But I also think it's unnecessary. A bill that is not in your agenda that I urge the trustees to strongly oppose is AB 1930, and it's a CSU and UC admission requirements that would take effect immediately because it's slated as an emergency bill. It will restrict the CSU to set our own admission criteria. And that is clearly a legislative interference into the control of the faculty, the Chancellor's Office, and the authority of the Board of Trustees over the curriculum, over our standards, over our admission requirements. If this bill has legs and goes somewhere, I strongly recommend to the board that we ferociously oppose it, because they're taking more and more authority that should lie within the CSU away from us, whether it be at the faculty level or at the Chancellor's Office level or at the Board of Trustees level. And we should guard against all these bills, whether we momentarily like them or not. They open the door to continued interference from the legislators.
All right. So I think I got them all down. So let me start with, let me make sure where I have it now. SB3. So this bill, this is a vehicle. It is technically still active, but the author could choose to do something different with it. You were right that the governor did weigh in last year on this issue. And if you would remember, there were some assembly bills that did as well. He also funded a longitudinal data set as part of the budget. So I do think it is unclear what will happen with this specific bill in the future. Secondly, on the BONTA, I think it was a BONTA bill 1154. That bill is one of the bills that will has not met the deadlines for 2-year bills, and so that bill will no longer be moving. The next one that you asked about are the fraternity and sorority bills. I think this is largely information that our campuses already collect. And so I think I will follow up with you on the exact requirements of the bill. That would be fine. But my understanding is largely something that we already do. We have a pending position because we do have want some clarity about who's responsible for providing that information. And then the final bill on the AB 1836, that bill, if you remember when the parking audit came out, there were a number of recommendations that came to us as the CSU that we need to implement, and there were a couple that went to the legislature. And so this bill is in line with the recommendations to the legislature. 1930. Oh, I'm sorry. And So no, we don't. We have a pending position on it right now. As part of our process that you would remember, each year at the beginning of the legislative session, we do bring to the board legislative principles. And as part of those legislative principles, we have a consultation process. And so in the early part of March, we will be having a meeting with our chair and vice chair to review bills, our strategies and positions. And we'll be taking formal positions after that consultation process.
Can I just add, Nicole, wasn't that the bill, the Medina bill that you did mention in your remarks, but did not make it into the
Correct.
report in time? And the way we read the bill, much of what's being asked is what we've already agreed to in the quantitative reasoning proposal. But as Nicole says, it's too early just now to take a position, a formal position.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley, for mentioning that. And I see the connection to our quantitative reasoning proposal. However, that bill would, while it might have our proposal in mind, will be applicable to all future admission requirements. So I would not feel at ease just knowing that what we're proposing tomorrow would actually fit within that bill, because that bill is very restrictive and it will haunt us in the future.
Thank you. Duly noted.
Jack.
I would just hope that we continue to work with the Academic Senate to oppose AB 1460. Our curriculum's complicated enough. Adding the legislature to it would be madness.
Yes, thank you.
Any additional questions?
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Vice Chancellor. Long time no see. I don't believe we discussed it, SB 493, and the decision to, or the idea to oppose it unless amended. Can you briefly talk about?
Sure.
The reason why?
This bill is Hannah Beth Jackson bill. It has to do with sexual harassment in Title IX. It's been very complicated issue,
Okay.
and there are some issues that are in the bill, especially a private right to action that's currently in the bill. We've worked very closely with the author's office, and in fact, our Office of General Counsel, the two folks that we've been working with most closely, have really been welcomed by the legislature and their perspectives. Our hope is to continue to work through these amendments and be able to move to a different position in the future, but we need to work through those amendments, and those conversations are ongoing.
And is it just CSU or is it UC as well? And do they have a Title IX coordinator or
Correct.
director? Is that right?
Correct. And it's also the independent colleges.
Okay. And so you'll circle back with us if it is amended, and is
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Trustee Taylor.
I didn't see much legislation in the way of capital support. Is there a reason for that?
I think largely, having the bond on the ballot, I think the legislature has that, and it's also a new year. I think that was the main thrust for last year. I would anticipate that there could be housing. That is going to be the issue du jour for the legislature this year. Mm-hmm. And I could see bills coming down the pike on
Remind me, Prop 13 on the March 3rd ballot, does that include any provision for student housing, or is that more flexible for us? I can't remember.
It requires all of our campuses to come up with a student housing plan, and our capital planning buildings and ground folks have been working with our campuses to ensure that we meet that requirement.
Well, great. I would also like to compliment our campus foundations who stepped up in a big way to contribute to the effort to get Prop 13 passed, including, I might add, a number of personal checks from our campus presidents, which are greatly appreciated and duly noted. And, oh, wait a minute, what? Oh, look, I've actually got remit forms here if anybody is interested in writing a check themselves. I have done so. I know our Chair Day is supportive. If you are interested, I won't give them to you here because it's a state building, but maybe later on tonight you can catch me, and I'm more than happy to talk to you about how you might contribute to the effort too. Well, thank you.
If no additional, Trustee Day.
Sorry, Chair Brago, just one last comment. I know you touched on it briefly in the report, but I've had conversations with CSSA in the past and have a meeting coming up soon too. I know financial aid is a high priority, so I want to make sure that we're all attuned to that this legislative session to ensure that we're working in sync and achieving the mutual goals.
Yes.
Thank you.
If no additional questions, we'll move on to the second information item, which is a federal legislative update. Vice Chancellor Garrett Ashley will once again begin the presentation. Garrett?
Thank you, Trustee Abrego. This presentation will provide an update on significant developments related to the CSU's federal priorities. Last year, the board approved the 2019-20 federal agenda, which encompasses 6 broad areas of priority: improve college access, timely completion through aid to students, prepare students for college success, foster degree completion for California's diverse population, educate students for tomorrow's workforce, solve societal problems through applied research, and enhance campus health, safety, and infrastructure. Despite many distractions, 2019 proved to be a year of significant developments for the CSU in Washington. In a huge victory for one of the system's top priorities, legislation was passed to permanently renew an expiring source of funding for Hispanic serving and Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. In addition, the maximum Pell Grant received a helpful boost, and spending on many other priority programs was increased. And the system continued to engage in support of Dreamers and on efforts to update the Higher Education Act. Assistant Vice Chancellor Jim Gelb is here to provide an update on CSU efforts and higher ed policy in Washington. Jim?
Thank you, Garrett, Chair Abrego, members of the board. As Garrett mentioned, system priorities for the current congressional session center on those 6 important topics. And the first one, bolstering aid programs like the Pell Grant. The Pell program currently helps support over 230,000 CSU students. The average grant is over $4,500, and that's a total of over $1 billion per year in support of our students. Next, preparing students for college success. That covers pipeline programs like Gear Up and TRIO, where our campuses partner with local schools on college readiness. The third bullet, fostering degree completion for California's diverse population, encompasses subjects like protecting Dreamers and support for programs that help build capacities at Hispanic serving and Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, or ANAPISI. Next is educating students for tomorrow's workforce. This includes, for example, funding for programs that support STEM education and teacher preparation. On the topic of solving problems through applied research, we advocate for robust funding for key agriculture and science programs that our institutions compete well in. And finally, enhancing campus health, safety, and infrastructure covers issues like federal assistance with basic needs and Title IX. So consistent with these priorities, the CSU was particularly active in 4 key areas in 2019. Seeking robust funding for priority programs in fiscal year or FY 2020, renewing the expiring program benefiting Hispanic serving institutions in ANAPISI, advocating in support of Dreamers, and preparing for the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Appropriations for priority programs. The new Congress started the year facing a set of austere caps on both defense and non-defense discretionary spending for FY 2020. The caps required that overall non-defense spending be cut by $54 billion, which put all of our system priority programs at serious risk. Indeed, the Trump administration proposed cuts totaling $10.7 billion from the Department of Education alone. After much effort by the CSU and others, a bipartisan deal was reached to raise the caps, setting the stage for a $27 billion increase in non-defense spending. Still, that did not guarantee that education programs would benefit in any meaningful way. While House appropriators had sought significant increases in education funding, their Senate counterparts have been aiming for relatively flat funding for education programs. Therefore, the CSU continued to advocate for significant increases to key higher education programs. The final results were good. For example, the maximum Pell Grant was boosted by $150 to $6,345 for the upcoming academic year. Other essential aid programs, such as the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant and federal work-study programs, received plus-ups. Several grant programs that support HSI and ANAPISI were increased by 15% across the board. TRIO and Gear Up, pipeline programs that enhance college readiness, saw increases, as did the Teacher Quality Partnership Program. In addition, several CSU programs at the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture also received increases, in some instances for the first time in many years. Mandatory funding for HSI and Anapeasy. 21 CSU campuses are designated as Hispanic serving institutions, and 14 are designated as Anapeasy, meaning that they serve large numbers of low-income and minority students. For the last decade, a significant amount of funding for competitive grants that help build capacity at HSI and Anapeasy came from a dedicated stream of mandatory funding that greatly supplemented annual discretionary appropriations that benefit these and other minority-serving institutions. Over the past decade, 17 CSU campuses have successfully competed for 28 grants funded by this mandatory stream, 22 HSI grants and 6 Anapeasy grants, totaling more than $120 million. These grants helped increase the number of students entering the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, through enhanced partnerships with community colleges, and supported mentoring and other programming to bolster student success. However, this mandatory funding expired after September 30th of 2019. After considerable advocacy by the CSU and other minority-serving institutions around the country, in December, the Congress passed a bill called the Future Act, which permanently renews the annual stream of mandatory funding, including $100 million per year for HSI and $5 million per year for Anapeasy. CSU campuses should be well positioned to continue to compete for these funds in future grant cycles, and institutions no longer need to worry about their expiration. Dreamers. The CSU has continued to advocate for legislation to permanently protect and support Dreamers. In June, the House passed the CSU-supported American Dream and Promise Act of 2019 on largely partisan lines. The legislation provides for conditional permanent residency and an earned path to citizenship for Dreamers. However, despite ongoing efforts by the CSU and many others in the higher education community, the Senate has shown no interest in moving legislation related to Dreamers while waiting for the Supreme Court to rule on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, cases it heard in November. The CSU joined an amicus brief in support of Dreamers in those cases, and a ruling is expected by the end of June. HEA reauthorization. The Higher Education Act authorizes the vast majority of federal student aid, pipeline, teacher preparation, and minority-serving institutions programs that matter to the CSU. Last reauthorized in 2008, the HEA is now long past due for renewal. This past year, the CSU reiterated its major reauthorization priorities on the Hill. These include restoring the purchasing power of the Pell Grant, indexing the maximum grant to inflation, reforming the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant and work-study programs to better target resources to needy students at campuses serving large numbers of low-income individuals, and ensuring continued support for minority institutions such as HSI and Anapeasy. In October, House Democrats on the Education Committee took an initial step by passing the College Affordability Act. It was drafted without Republican input. It's a comprehensive bill that includes positive treatment of many CSU priorities, including a big boost to the maximum Pell Grant and restoring the annual inflationary increase. It also eliminates student loan origination fees and restores subsidies for graduate student loans. But there are also some worrisome provisions, including expanding Pell to short-term programs and a new state partnership funding program that emphasizes community colleges but not four-year institutions. Plus, it's a very expensive bill and a pay-for has not been identified. The road ahead in the House is uncertain, though committee leadership hopes to bring the bill to the floor early this year. In the Senate, Education Committee leaders have been working to write their own bill. Because the Senate generally needs 60 votes to pass anything, it typically works to produce bipartisan measures, especially in education. This means any proposal it produces will be very different from the House effort, particularly with regard to hot-button issues and overall costs. While they've made progress, areas that have proven difficult include Title IX reforms and the treatment of for-profit institutions. And the recent success of the Future Act, which took care of the only time-sensitive piece of HEA reauthorization, may have lessened the sense of urgency to get it done this year. Looking ahead, 2020 is likely to be a very difficult year to get anything of substance done. First, the Congress is dealing with the ongoing impeachment process, which eats up time and raises tensions all around. Then there's the 2020 election, which will mean fewer days in session for the Congress and more partisan posturing. Despite the difficult environment, we will need to continue to work on HEA reauthorization, which at a minimum is likely to be an ongoing subject of discussion and messaging efforts. And we will have to work on funding priorities for FY 2021, which begins this October, and is likely to be a much tighter spending year. Plus, once the Supreme Court announces its decision on DACA, legislative proposals are likely to follow. And after the election, there will be a lame duck session, and some feel that might provide an opportunity for an HEA deal or perhaps a mini deal on some bipartisan pieces. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. Any questions? Romy?
Thank you very much for the presentation. This will be an easy question. Overall, that seems that you had relatively good success in Washington, given the conditions in the Capitol. Just at the very end, I was surprised about a statement you made. You said it will be a difficult year because it's an election year. Mm-hmm. And I wonder why this is difficult and not in our favor. Education spending is generally viewed favorably by the larger public. The candidates will have to listen to us, right? They will have, or they should take a position or make promises. And, I know a promise is a promise, but a promise is better than no promise, right? Whether it becomes reality after elections, I don't know. But I think they're open to our arguments, and they're kind of feel compelled to offer something, right, in order to get elected. And also, if nothing else, couldn't a campaign be used as a tool for us to get exposure for our often obscure but very worthy causes, right? I think the general public does not really know about funding for Hispanic serving institutions, NSF grants, etc. But this might be an opportunity to bring these very necessary causes to the attention of a greater public. So you say this is difficult, but it can be used to our advantage, I hope.
Yeah, sure. And when I say it's difficult, I think, just to get legislation passed. It's going to be harder to get legislation passed because of the political environment and the limited amount of time that the Congress is actually going to spend in Washington, D.C. Yes, there will be a lot of messaging going on that, yes, will matter down the road, and it's important to engage on that level. The other thing I would say is that when the Congress made a deal last year to raise the spending caps by a not insignificant amount for 2019 or FY 2020, they also agreed that to raise the caps for this year, but only by a tiny amount. And so that is already done. And so we're dealing with that. Sure.
Okay, Trustee McGorry.
I'd like to add one a priority to the list of the 6 that you have, and that would be to increase and improve the administration of veterans benefits. I know last year, I think many of the campuses realized that the veterans didn't get their benefits on time. There was a big screw up in Washington. It's a 2-month delay. We had to backfill some of those benefits. I think we ought to really aggressively support legislation that expedites the administration and increases the benefits.
Yes, and actually, we do include that concept under the bullet that covers our diverse student body. And when we articulate that more broadly, we always include veterans in that. Absolutely.
Trustee Fong.
It's wonderful news that the Future Act got passed, which permanently renews the annual stream for ANAPZ and for HSI. And I was wondering if you could answer if there still is the issue that those campuses requesting funds must decide if they are an HSI or ANAPZ institution because they cannot receive funds as both?
It's a very good and complicated question,
Yes.
Trustee Fong. There are multiple programs benefiting HSI and benefiting ANAPZ throughout the Higher Education Act that are administered by the Department of Education. And it is the difference between the programs. The main thing is that some are funded by annual discretionary appropriations and some are funded by mandatory funds, which were covered by the Future Act, that are automatically available from year to year. And so it is possible for an institution that is both an HSI and an NPZ to receive grants from, as long as one is from the discretionary side and one is from the mandatory side. So we actually have had a couple of CSU campuses that have received HSI funding through the discretionary side and NPZ funding through the mandatory side, or vice versa. But you can't get two grants from the same bucket in the same time frame. And we have had an instance or two in the past where a campus has competed successfully out of the same bucket for both, and they've had to choose between the two.
Any additional questions? I'd like to recognize and thank both Jim and Nicole for your presentations and for your effective advocacy work. I am truly impressed that the federal legislation budget increased during a time when we were really facing some budget cutbacks. It's incredible the coalition that was formed to get a bipartisan support of the Future Act. And I know the CSU was very active in providing some of this leadership. So thank you both. And of course, working under the leadership of Ashley. Chairman Day, this concludes the business of the Committee on Governmental
Real quick,
Relations.
Trustee Abrego?
One
here.
question here.
Yeah,
Oh.
just a quick question.
Okay, go
Is
ahead.
that okay?
Yes.
Thank you, thanks. So I guess, when we were earlier on talking about the Future Act, I was just wondering, what does the amount of funds depend on when it's, given to a specific institution?
The fund
So I guess, when we were talking about HSI, right? And so let's say a campus does identify as a Hispanic serving institution. And it's given the funds, I guess, when it comes to how much that is, who identifies that, and what does it depend on?
So the Department of Education administers those grants, and they set up a competition typically on a 5-year grant cycle, and the department sets the criteria for the competition based on what's in the statute, and then they set the sort of target goal. They say, well, we'll do 20 grants at X million dollars on average each, and then depending upon the proposals they get, they fund as many as they can under those criteria. Does that make sense?
And so when it comes to giving specific campuses a specific account or a specific, number of monies, right? What does that depend on?
So the department says we're entertaining applications for the HSI program, and we plan to fund, 20 grants of roughly $5 million each. Okay. And then they will accept applications for that and choose the best ones based on the range of criteria that they publish.
Thanks.
Any additional questions? I'll look around this time. Chair Day, this concludes the Committee on Government Relations.
Thank you, Chair Abrego.